Exposure. Years ago, many years ago, when I got this camcorder, life was pretty simple in terms of exposure because it had an auto and it had a manual button. When I pressed manual and I wanted to do it myself, I could just raise or lower the exposure. Life was pretty simple. Then I got one of these Canon DSLRs and I was like, man, where does it say exposure? I can't find it anywhere. How do I change exposure? Well, to tell you guys, basically, and we're going to go through each one of these in great detail. Basically, exposure is made up of three different things, and you can change it basically three different ways. And it forms a triangle. One is ISO, the other one is shutter speed, and the last one is aperture. And we're going to be discussing all that stuff, but before we do, we need to talk about metering. On the still side, we got 4 different metering modes. Evaluative, spot metering, partial metering, and center weighted average. On the video side, we only get one, and that's center weighted average. It's the only one we get. When it pretty much comes to metering, pretty much all cameras are the same from what I understand, especially the Canon cameras. They're all pretty much set up for the exposure for what this is right in the middle. This is called 18% gray. This is a digital calibration target we're going to be using a lot. So all of them are set for that particular level of neutral gray or darkness. So to demonstrate this, here, let me turn the camera off and let's turn it back on again. And down here is your meter. It's basically a light meter, just showing you how dark or light the scene is. And if it's right in the middle, you've pretty much accomplished what it considers 18% gray. If you don't see a tick mark, just go ahead and lightly touch on the shutter and you'll get the tick mark to come up. And if I move the camera around, you'll see that it got darker and it's getting even darker. Or move it back, it goes back to where I had set it before at neutral. So that's pretty much how the meter works. The meter is really a mathematical tool to get you close. It's not going to get you all the way. For instance, the best example I can show is here's an actress and I had to make a decision where there was so much light coming in from the window. If I were to go off by the meter, it was telling me I was a stop too bright, but I knew it, I wasn't because I'd used an 18% gray card, got the exposure exactly where I wanted it before she sat down, and then I knew I got her skin and her shirt was going to be properly exposed. The window, I just had to make a judgment call. I knew everything in the window was going to go white, and I was going to blow out all the detail in the trees that were outside the window, and it was just a judgment call. So sometimes when you're setting exposure, it's not using just one tool like this meter. We're going to be using a lot of different tools and subjective things to come up with really good exposure. All right, before we start talking about shutter speed, I want to talk about exposure, how important it is. You have to really nail the exposure. You could be maybe a third of a stop under, a third of a stop over the exposure that you want. That'll be pretty close, but if you start getting a stop over or under, then things start being nasty and really hard to fix in post. So let me demonstrate this. Here I am down in my studio. It's kind of a high contrast shot, which I wanted to try just one light. And what I did is I used a digital calibration target, which has 18% gray, and I put that 18% gray right in the middle of the histogram. And then what I've got here is on the left-hand side, I've got evenly exposed on the left, and I've got one stop underexposed on the right. Now you'll notice on the right, the skin starts getting this kind of reddish tint to it, and it has almost looks a little bit sunburned sometimes when you underexpose. Now if I go 2/3 of a stop underexposed, it's starting to look a little bit better, but it still doesn't look quite right. And then a third of a stop actually looks very good. I could have used the third of a stop down. In fact, a lot of the times what I'll do, if the even exposure looks too bright, I'll actually back it down a third of a stop. And I'll show you why here in a second. Now when we go a third of a stop overexposed, we start losing not skin texture, but the skin tone itself actually starts going away. It's looking more white. Here's 2/3 of a stop. And when we have a full stop, which is way too bright. Now what happens here is, let's say you've gone out and you've shot something overexposed, especially when it comes to a person or a skin tone. When you go to try to recover it, here what I've done is I used the waveform and I've matched the two as best I could. And they match that actually quite well in terms of levels. But what you'll notice here is my skin tone is now less saturated on the right-hand side. And also, by bringing up some of these levels, I have introduced noise into the black background as well. Stepping to 2/3 of a stop, it's starting to look better, but not as saturated in the skin tones. And then we've got 1/3 of a stop, is looking pretty darn good, actually. So if you're like 1/3 of a stop above or 1/3 of a stop below, it works pretty well. Now we'll go to 2/3 of a stop over. Now the skin is kind of taking on this, how do I describe it? Here, let me show you one stop overexposed. One stop, trying to fix that is really hard. I can't tell you how many times I've done it myself, where I've been outside just filming myself and the clouds are in when I started recording, and then all of a sudden the clouds went away and the sun's shining directly on my face, and I'm like at least a stop over exposed, and then trying to fix it in post. You get this kind of effect. And I don't know what the term is, but when you try to correct it, you get this kind of like a terracotta color, like a pot that you put plants into has that kind of terracotta color and texture. And that's kind of what happens to your skin, is when you're way overexposed and you try to bring it down, you get that kind of look. So again, I just want to talk about the importance of exposure. And if you're going to be, my rule of thumb is, try to nail it as best you can. If you're 1/3 of a stop below, I think you're totally fine, but try to get as best you can, and it'll make your images look so much better. All right, shutter speed, ISO, and aperture are all related. They kind of form a triangle in terms of exposure. All I want you to know for right now is they are related, and I'm going to demonstrate how they're related later on. So first up is shutter speed, and I think shutter speed is probably the easiest one to start with because it's almost a set and forget type thing. I'd say the majority of the time I'm shooting at a 50th of a second. Sometimes I shoot at a 60th of a second. Sometimes I shoot at 125th of a second. Sometimes I even shoot higher than that with shutter speed. And I'll explain where I got those numbers later. All right, so let's talk about where I came up with the numbers 50th of a second, 60th of a second, and 125th of a second. Those are the ones I most commonly use. Before we talk about, we got to talk about frame rates. So movies, 24 frames per second, video, TV, broadcast, 30 frames per second for the most part. So I myself personally shoot at 24 frames per second. And the main reason I do, I kind of like the film look, but really when it comes down to it is when you're publishing to the web like I do, almost exclusively. In fact, I've never had anything on TV that have been broadcast that I know of. But basically what happens is when you upload to YouTube, Vimeo, Blip TV, all of them, no matter what frame rate you shot it in and then you put it into your timeline, let's say it was 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second, they're all going to retranscode it. They're all going to reconform it basically down to 24 frames. Because for them, it's much easier to do that. It's less computer intensive, and for your smartphone, your computer, 24 frames a second, it's easier to do on the web than 30 frames per second. So step one in terms of picking my shutter speed is I pick my frames per second. So if I'm shooting at, let's say 1080, 24 frames per second, I'm going to double it. So that's 48th of a second shutter speed. There is no 48th shutter speed on the Canon cameras, so I picked the next best thing, which is 50th of a second. So why double the frame rate to get the shutter speed? Well, to understand that, we have to go back to how cameras used to work, and they used to use their rotary shutter. And to demonstrate this, I'll show you this little thing I created. And basically, the square rectangle is your frame, and the CD that I've got is the rotary shutter. So as you see, as I rotate the rotary shutter, that half the time the frame is exposed and half the time it's not. And there's a term for this, and it's called the 180-degree shutter rule. And basically, when you look at a circle, it's 360 degrees, and if you chop it in half, you get 180 degrees. And that's what's happening is half the time the shutter, half the time the frame is exposed, and half the time it's not. So if we do a little math and we take 1/24 and we divide by 2, we get 1/48, or in our case, the Canon camera's 1/50th of a second shutter speed. All right, so what does a shutter speed of 1/50th look like for your videos? So let me demonstrate. Here I am golfing in my backyard, and you'll notice when I swing and then I freeze the frame, you can't see the golf club at all. It's totally gone. But then when I take it and then I increase the shutter speed from 50th of a second to 1,000th of a second and I stop it, you can see now that you can actually see the golf club. And then just to demonstrate on slow motion, where I shot this at 60 frames per second and I slowed it down to 24 frames per second in my timeline, you can see that the amount of blur on the golf club is the same as when I shot it at a 50th of a second. So I'm using the same 180-degree shutter rule for the slow motion as I am for the regular speed. So I don't always shoot at 50th of a second or always follow the 180-degree rule. There's sometimes when I do some action, it's pretty rare, but if I have an action scene, because I don't do that much action, I will film at maybe 2/50th or 500 to give that more staccato, choppy look, technical look, and it adds, especially in a chase scene or something like that, it adds a lot of more edginess to it, and it helps your viewer feel like they're actually in the action. Another reason I will change the shutter speed is when I'm in, let's say, an environment with a lot of fluorescent lights, or maybe some even cheaper LED lights, when you start getting what's called banding. And so what I'll do is I'll actually play with the shutter speed, because some of those are based off the frequency. So I'll actually, instead of shooting at a 50th of a second, I might go down to a 30th or try a 40th. I might go up to a 60th, an 80th. I'll play around with it until I find where that banding kind of goes away and it's not present with those cheaper fluorescent lights. Okay, shutter speed as it pertains to exposure. As you can see here, I'm starting out at a 50th of a second and I'm working my way up in terms of shutter speed. I'm going up to like 2,000ths or 4,000ths of a second, and it makes it a lot darker. On the reverse side, if you go from a 50th and you go down, you can do a 40th and you can do a 30th. So it gives you a third of a stop or 2/3 of a stop more light. So if you're in a situation where you're like this, and the person, let's say, doesn't talk with their hands much and waving their arms around, and it's basically just a talking head like this, go down to a 30th of a second. If you need more light, let's say your lens won't let you go farther. Let's say it goes only down to 5.6 and you need just 2 more thirds of stop of light. Go down to a 30th of a second. Not a problem, because you're not going to see much difference in terms of motion blur of the person talking like I am. So the other thing I want to talk about is there's really no right or wrong shutter speed. And it just, use whatever you want, play around with it, and you'll get an understanding. Sure, a 50th of a second or using the 180-degree rule will get you close, get you started, because even if we were to follow the rule, we should be at a 48th of a second. We're going to a 50th of a second. So play around with it, have some fun. A great exercise for you guys to do is go out to like a water fountain and just turn it on, and as the water arcs, shoot it at like a 50th of a second, and also shoot it at a high shutter speed and see what happens. Or water passing by in a river. Just try a lot of different examples and you'll get an idea of what that shutter is doing to your image and how it makes you feel when you watch it. So that's pretty much it for shutter speed. All right, really quickly, I want to talk about slow motion in the post-production workflow. Again, we're really not talking about computers and nonlinear editors in this course because it goes well beyond the scope of this course, but really quick, I want to tell you, when we're shooting for slow motion, we're shooting at 60 frames per second, which is 720p. and you let's say you've increased your shutter to 1/25 of a second to get that nice consistent motion blur. Basically what we do is we've taken 60 frames, and we don't need all 60 frames per second. You could do it in 24 frames per second, but we've got all these extra frames in there, and what we can do with it is when we put it on the timeline, we can then take it and stretch it out. So you're going from 60 frames and you're stretching it all the way to 24 frames on the 24 frame timeline. So basically when you're doing that is you're getting silky smooth slow motion. Because if you do try to do the same thing, you put a clip on the timeline that's shot at 24 frames a second, like 1080, and then you try to almost double the length of the clip like you do with the 60 frames per second, you're going to get really choppy, kind of not very fluid slow motion. But when you put the 60 frames per second on the timeline, you won't, kind of double it. You're going to get this very fluid slow motion. So again, I don't really want to show you how to do it because it goes well beyond the scope of this course, but I know I keep talking about slow motion because I just wanted to tell you, basically bring it on the timeline, and then do the calculations to go from 60 frames down to 24. A lot of times you don't even have to do the calculation. If you're in Premiere Pro, you just say reinterpret the footage from 60 down to 23.976, 23.976, and it'll give you that beautiful slow motion. ISO. So what is ISO? ISO is a measurement of your camera's sensitivity to light. All right, sounds really technical. So what exactly does that all mean? Think of it this way. You all have probably access to a stereo system. If you were to play music and then you turn the volume all the way down while the music's playing, you put your ear up to the speaker, you're not going to hear anything. You obviously turn up the volume, it gets louder. You put your ear up to it, definitely gets louder. But the same thing applies with your camera's sensor. As you apply more ISO, the higher the number goes, the more bright your image becomes. And just as with music, as if you were to play music, turn the volume up and hit pause the music and put your ear up to the speaker, you're going to be able to hear a whole bunch of background hiss and noise, depending how good your amplifier is. And the same thing applies with your camera's sensor. The higher you go with the ISO number, let's say 6400 for instance, you look at the image, you're going to start to notice more and more noise creep into your image. All right, of the three elements that make up exposure, ISO is one that can degrade your image. It changes the exposure, and it doesn't really give you anything creatively, unless you like noise as a creative element. But shutter speed, as we talked about earlier, can give you a certain look in terms of motion blur. And f-stop, or aperture, we're going to be talking about next, that one will definitely give you a different look as you raise or lower the number, and it also changes the exposure. So ISO, really have to pay attention to it. If you don't like the look of grain or noise, definitely you want to shoot with a lot of things in mind, from contrast to lighting, a lot of stuff we're going to be talking about here in a second. All right, next step we're going to do is do the old lens cap test. So I'm just going to put the lens cap on the lens. I'm going to run through all the different ISOs. So what I've done already is, on the far right, we got ISO 100, which is our cleanest ISO. And then what we're going to do is move our way over. And as we can see all the way on the left at 25,600, which is just insane what you can shoot at. We're definitely getting some noise. And sometimes, if you're watching this on a mobile device, again, you're probably not going to see this. And sometimes on your monitor, what you have to do is just kind of look around left or right to actually see the noise. Sometimes you have to be a little bit off axis to really see a lot of the noise. So just to keep in mind exactly what the noise looks like at a high ISO. So just how far can you push this full frame camera? And you can actually push it a lot. 1600, no problem. You might see a little bit of noise. 3200, I've definitely gone there. And in some instances, I've gone as high as 6400 when I've really needed to. Beyond that, I really don't go higher than that, because then you do really start getting into noise. Unless you really have to get the shot, then you can definitely go and push it as far as you like. But typically, and it depends on what you're viewing it on, because if the audience is only viewing it on, like, let's say an iPhone, go ahead and push it as hard as you want, because by the time it gets downscaled all the way to that iPhone device, the amount of pixelation and noise that you're going to see is going to be pretty minimal. All right, let me give you a few guidelines of where to set your ISO. If you're outside, bright sunny day, ISO 100. Let's say if it's cloudy and maybe you're under a tree or something like that, maybe ISO 200. As let's say you move indoors and you have a lot of natural light coming in, you might be going to ISO 400. It all depends because the relationship between the shutter speed, if you're keeping your shutter speed at like 50th a second and you're shooting for 1080, that's fine. And it depends where your f-stop is. If you need a lot of depth of field, not shallow depth of field, but you need like your actor or actress or your talent is moving a lot and you need to be shooting at like f8, then obviously you're going to need to pump up your ISO. But as you get into situations where, let's say, there's no natural light coming in from outside and you're just using the light in the room, it depends on the light. I mean, I've got some pretty bright lights here that are actually supplementing from what's coming in outside, but in most cases, you might be ISO 800, you might be 1250, maybe 1600. For the most part, I've found in certain lighting situations, if I light really well, I usually don't have to go above 1600. When you get to 3200 and 6400, you're in situations where you can't control the light. Let's say you're in a gymnasium and you're shooting for slow motion, so you got your shutter speed at 125th of a second, then you're going to need to pump your ISO quite a bit. All right, next up I want to show you two different shots. Which one do you think is shot at a higher ISO, the one on the left or the one on the right? Well, to be honest, they're both shot at the exact same ISO, 25,600. And I usually don't shoot at this high of an ISO. I usually don't go above 6,400. But in this case, I want to show it because you can see it a lot better. So what's the difference between the two? They're lit differently. There's different lighting. One has high contrast and the one has lower contrast. Before you start thinking, all right, I better not shoot low contrast. I better shoot everything high contrast. Well, it's not that. What I want to show you is look at the one on the right, and I'm going to draw an oval around that area between the very dark and the very light. There is not much living in that kind of that gradient going between light and dark. And if we look at a waveform monitor, I know this is kind of an advanced topic, but if you look at a waveform monitor in your nonlinear editor, that noise usually resides between 20 and 30 IRE. So what we want to do is we want to light our scene in such a way where we don't have many pixels in that 20 to 30 IRE. Well, we don't have a waveform monitor, unfortunately, on these Canon cameras, but what we can do is I can kind of give you a guideline in terms of what that looks like in your histogram, because your histogram, again, shows you brightness left to right and the amount of pixels up and down. So if you have a lot of pixels living in this region, and let me show you on this histogram right here, you want to stay away from this where I'm putting this oval right here. If you have a lot of pixels living in that area, then you're going to run into very noisy situations running at, like, let's say 6,400. So an example would be, let's say you're doing an interview and the person's sitting in a chair like I am. And let's say the back wall, which in this case it's not because I have this lit by the windows, a lot of lights coming in from that window. Let's say that back wall was living between that 20 to 30 IRE, or on the histogram, it's in that kind of area. And you're shooting at a very high ISO for some reason. Let's say you don't have good enough lights, or the person's moving around a lot, and you're shooting at a very high f-stop, and you're shooting at, let's say, 6,400. Well, that wall is going to be very noisy, but what you can do is if you have, a little LED light, and sometimes the little tiny ones, they're about that big, they're not that much money, 40 or 50 bucks, and you can just, has a rotary switch, or rotary knob on it, you can just gently increase it and then watch your histogram and watch all those pixels, the amount of pixels in that area kind of go away. And then if you need to shoot at that really high ISO, you can. So what it comes down to is you got to learn how to light, and you got to learn the weakness of your camera. In our case, with these Canon cameras, these full frame cameras, it's usually between 20 and 30 IRE. You just kind of have to watch out for that. All right, just to reinforce this, I want to show you an example down in my studio. This first shot is where I'm down in the studio. I'm only being lit by two soft boxes in front of me. And I've done it in such a way where I've distanced myself away from the wall. That wall is actually a white bed sheet. And the light is falling off enough to where it's turning this very dark gray. And it's running into that 20, and actually I've lit it so it's living in that 20 to 30 IRE range. And you can see it's incredibly noisy. Now, the next shot, I did not change the lighting at all. I changed the white bed sheet out for a totally black bed sheet. And look at the difference. If you look at the two between the dark one and the grayish kind of background, they look night and day in terms of noise, don't they? The black background looks cleaner. Now we could take this to another extreme. Let's say you didn't want a black background, but you wanted to use the white one. Well, here's the white one. Again, all I did here now is I didn't relight myself. All I did was I lit the white bed sheet so it was a lot brighter. So again, just another example is, learning the weakness of your camera. In this case, don't want to shoot around 20 or 30 IRE, or in your case, if you don't want to know about waveform monitors, your histogram, you just kind of want to stay away from this area on your histogram. And if you do that and you learn how to light really well, you can push these full frame cameras amazing to like 6400 and shoot quite cleanly. All right, before we move on to Aperture, let's recap. Shutter speed does basically two things. You've got exposure control, and you got somewhat of a creative control when it comes to how much motion blur you want, in terms of how you want a lot of motion blur or very little motion blur. ISO basically does only one thing, and that would be exposure control. It does have the extra added feature of noise, which you kind of want to stay away from unless that's the kind of look you want to go for. And then Aperture does two things as well. It basically does exposure control, and probably the most important, to me anyway, the most creative thing that you get out of these type of DSLR cameras is the shallow depth of field. This shot, for instance, is shot at 1.8, and you can see it has a very pleasing bokeh. Basically, bokeh is how items look out of focus, and these circles that you see are basic, and you've seen it just probably in about every movie, are basically Christmas lights way out of focus, and they create this very large circle. And it's not just for Christmas lights, it's other things. It's how, when you're shooting somebody with trees in the background, for instance, and light maybe streaming through it, and you put the trees way out of focus, and you just focus on the person that you're interviewing that's very close to you. Those trees with that light coming through can create a very pleasing bokeh as well. It's not just Christmas lights. Then if we compare it to what it looks like at 5.6, you can see that the bokeh, or the size of the Christmas lights, have gone down dramatically in terms of how out of focus they are, because now the depth of field is increasing. We don't have a very shallow depth of field, we have a very long or large depth of field. I don't even really like the term depth of field. I think it's very confusing for people that are beginning. I know when I first started, it was like, depth of field? What? I would call it depth of focus, and I think other people have called it depth of focus. Now, if you look at this shot, this is a really good example. This is just basically a texture, a carpet, and this is a great exercise for you guys to do to learn how shallow, open up your lens wide open. And that's a term we can talk about really quickly. A lot of people are going to say wide open, and when you're shooting wide open, that means that the blades, the aperture is as wide as it can be. And basically, to define aperture, if you don't know by now, is basically how much light is allowed into the lens. And it's restricted by those blades, or it can be unrestricted by just bring it wide open. Another couple terms really quick. People are going to refer to fast glass. Typically, if you have a cheaper zoom, it's not really considered fast glass because it's a very slow lens. It can only go to, let's say, 5.6 if you zoom all the way out. Another term is stopping down. When people say stopping down, they refer to taking those blades and restricting them down. That's called stopping down. And then wide open, again, is opening that aperture all the way up. So it can be very confusing when you're first starting. You think, well, I've got an f/22 and I've got a f/1.8. You know, isn't the 22 wide open? No, it's not. That's backwards. And that's the way I kind of thought when I first picked up my camera. It's kind of counterintuitive. The best way I can describe it to you, but maybe that you can remember it, is think of a swimming pool. I listened to a podcast with Silverine, and he gave this analogy, and I think it's really quite good. Basically, if you look at a swimming pool and you think of the shallow end as your, let's say, your 1.8 or 2.8 that your lens can do, and then you look at the deep end, which is like an f/22, let's say, the deep end has a lot of water in it. So the amount of things that are in focus, the depth of the pool is very large. Whereas you go to the very shallow end, let's say it's one of those really, those pools that have a gradual grade. At the very end, you have a very, just a little bit of water. Well, that is, it's your 1.8 or 2.8. It's very shallow. So that might be a way for you guys to remember it. Sometimes I get lots of questions like, Dave, what aperture did you shoot that at? Or what did you do here? Or what did you do there? Kind of thing. And I want to tell you, there's really no right or wrong aperture. It's just like shutter speed. There's no right or wrong. Whatever looks good to you. So basically, if you're trying to separate somebody from the background and you want to concentrate if that part of the story or whatever you're doing, maybe you're doing an interview and you want that person to just know what that person's talking about, and you want to take all the distractions away from the background, basically. A great thing to do is shoot at a very narrow depth of field, shallow depth of field. Maybe like a 3.2, maybe even a 2.8 if the person's not moving much. Right now, I am filming myself at 3.2 because I know personally I'm not going to move much in this chair. If you're interviewing somebody that moves around a lot, I would suggest bumping that up maybe to a 5.6. A great way to do this is the punch-in tool that we talked about earlier. So basically when you've got the person doing an interview, tell them to move around, lean in, lean out as much as they're going to do in the interview. So they might say, well, I might lean forward a little bit to make my point, and I might lean back to be more, think about something. And then when they do that, make sure that punch in and look right at their eye, and make sure that it's in focus there. And then when they lean in, and then they maybe take their glasses off and they make a dramatic point, that when they lean in a little bit, that their eye is also in focus. And that might be 5.6. That's a great place to start. For me, I know just from years of doing this, I don't move that much in my chair, and I could easily go down to 2.8 and I'll still, and I focus right on one of my eyes, usually the eye that's closest to the camera. Because once you get to like 1.8, which I wouldn't recommend doing that, that's just way too, or 1.4 or 1.2, that becomes so narrow. Just the distance between your eyelash and your, the reflective part of your eye, those two things can be different in terms of focus. It's wafer thin. It's not waffle thin, it's like wafer thin. As you can see here by moving up and down the carpet, zoomed in, we could see that the tape measure, it doesn't take much. You just move that focus ring a little bit and it changes the focus dramatically. So you can be quite out of focus just by tapping your lens at 1.4. All right, pretty much we've been talking about this lens. It's the 50 millimeter 1.8. I love it. It's cheap. If you're really low on cash and you haven't bought one yet, go pick one up. Awesome lens. Beautiful bokeh, super sharp. Has a little bit of vignetting when you're shooting wide open, but not too bad. So there's a 1.4 version of this. It's a lot more. It's like 3 times more expensive. The big benefit of that one, it has a larger focus ring. So if you're pulling focus a lot, definitely get that lens in if you got the cash. All right, so we've been talking about primes. This is a prime, meaning it is not a zoom. So we need to now go to another type of lens, and that is the zoom. This is a very large zoom. And when you get large and expensive glass, usually means one thing, that it's constant or fixed aperture throughout the entire zoom range on the minimum number. And when we say minimum, that's the lowest aperture, how wide open it is. This one is at 2.8, so I can zoom from 70 all the way to 200 at 2.8 and nothing will happen to the blades inside of for the aperture, which is wonderful. The downside is it's heavier and it's a lot more expensive. Now, if you're going with a cheaper, this is a much cheaper lens. It's a zoom lens. It's the 28 to 135. It's a great all-around lens, a great travel lens. I've used it a ton. It's fairly sharp, and it has really good image stabilization, which I like. But the problem with this, and especially for beginners, is what happens is the thing that kind of trips you up a little bit is when you're at 28 or even to about 35, I think it happens, you can shoot at this minimum aperture, which is 3.5. And then, because it'll be written on the lens what the range is. And then if I can find the label real quick. Oh, it's right here. So it's 3.5 to 5.6, meaning that you're going to get a difference. It's not constant, it's not fixed aperture. So when I zoom from all the way to 28 to 135, what's going to happen is when I start out at 28, it'll be 3.5, but by the time I get to 135, it'll have stopped down. The blades will have gotten constricted to 5.6. And you can see that here in this demonstration with the gray card. As I zoom in, you'll see that it gets darker. So one of the things you could just say to yourself is, well, I really shouldn't be zooming while I'm filming. I should just stop recording, reposition, and get the next shot. Typically, I don't ever zoom. It's very rare that I zoom while I'm filming. All right, just a few recommendations to get you started. When you're going outside and it's a bright sunny day and you're shooting at a 50th of a second in ISO 100, you're typically going to be around, at least in Colorado, you're going to be around f/16. It's a great place to start. If you want to go down from there and it's a really sunny day, you're going to need to put an ND filter on it. And again, we're not really talking about extra accessories here, but if you want to be shooting at like a 3.5 on a bright sunny day, you're going to need to screw on an ND filter or some sort of sunglasses, basically, for your lens, so you can basically open up the lens at a wider aperture. All right, and then when you move inside, a great place to start, depending on your lighting situation, obviously, but you're going to be like maybe at a 5.6 is a great place to start, and your ISO might be at ISO 400. If it gets really dimly lit, maybe you're going down to 2.8 if your lens can actually do that. So the depth of field is also related to a couple other things, how much you're zooming and the distance. For instance, and how, because if you're shooting at a very wide angle lens, let's say, for instance, like the GoPro, I have a GoPro and I was shooting a time lapse and it was super wide and it was super sunny. And the darn thing was shooting at f2.8 and everything was in focus. Why? Because I was shooting at such a wide angle lens. And if I'm shooting at 24 on a full frame camera, which is much wider than, we talked about on a crop sensor camera, again, a lot of things are going to be in focus past 5 or 6 feet from the camera. So if you're shooting at, let's say, 1.4 and it's very dimly lit, but your subject, let's say, is 50 feet away, well, they can move in and out of focus. It's going to take them a bit. But if they're like 2 feet from the camera, let's say this particular lens, I can go as close as 1.5 feet. So if I have my subject 1.5 feet away from this camera, if they move just a few millimeters, they're going to be out of focus. It doesn't take much at all. So it's dependent on your distance. So again, if let's say you're doing an interview and the person's, let's say, typically 8 feet away from the camera, or I'm right here, I'm about maybe 5 feet from the camera, but let's say they're about 7 feet from the camera, they can move a little bit, and depending on how much you're zoomed and what your f-stop is. So it's something that you're going to just have to play with. I just can't give you all the scenarios because there's too many. There's too many variables. The zoom, the distance, and your f-stop. All right, next up is the histogram. It's actually easier than it looks. If you haven't got it on your display, just hit your info button 2 or 3 times and it'll appear. Basically on the lower axis, we've got basically brightness. All the way to the left is black, all the way to the right is white. And I'm shooting a digital calibration target, black, neutral gray, 18% gray, and white. And that's why we're seeing these 3 discrete spikes. It's indicating over here is the black. And the best way to get your head around this is I'm going to zoom in as far as I can. Let's see if I can do this. And I'm just going to try to show you the blacks. So there is all just blacks. And if I rotate it, and you can see pretty much just gray. And if I rotate it to the whites, for the most part, I can get the whites in there. So basically, the histogram on the lower axis is just showing you the brightness. Now, the other axis is the quantity of pixels. So let's go ahead and zoom back out again. And you can see as we fill the frame here, we've got black, gray, and white. And up here at the top, it's basically showing you the number of pixels. Well, coming from an audio background, I'd be a little worried right now because it almost looks like, in fact, it looks like they're flattened at the top. It's just the quantity of pixels. It has nothing to do like with audio where you have a waveform and the wave hits the top, then you know you're pretty much distorted or you've lost the signal. You're clipping basically. Well, think of this graph rotated 90 degrees in terms of audio. It's not the top that you have to worry about. It doesn't matter if these are clipping at the top or what you think are flattened at the top, I should say. What you do want to worry about is, let's say if I bring up the exposure, right here where I've just sent right there, the whites are being clipped. And that's what you want to worry about is when you clip these. Right there, it's okay. And then right there, we've clipped the whites. All right, next up I want to talk about contrast and how it affects your exposure. Right now, I normally shoot in neutral with the contrast all the way down. And we could see that we've got a pretty well properly exposed image here. And we could see that the whites are not clipping. If I were to bring down the f-stop number, then you can see now our whites are clipping. So what I want to do now is hit the Q button, and I'm going to go from the neutral picture style to the standard picture style. And then you'll notice what just happened is before where we had a lot of space, safety margin, now it appears like we have pretty much none. And one of the other tools that we have at our disposal, which I want to take a look at right now, is I'm going to hit the record button and I'm going to hit stop. Just hit record a few seconds. You can do this with just taking a quick picture too if you like. And then I'm going to hit the playback button. And then what you're going to notice here is what I call the blinkies. You can see it's flashing black in that area where actually the light is kind of coming down at it at an angle, so it's a lot hotter at the top. And it's basically saying, hey, you're clipping right there. So in the standard picture style, we are clipping. So if I go back and we change it back to the neutral picture style, and then I hit record, just for a second or two, then hit play, and we can see it's not flashing anymore, and you can see the histogram looks just fine. So picture styles and contrast can definitely play into exposure. So you got to be really careful when you're setting your exposure with one picture style. You might not want to go to a different picture style. Okay, you really want to nail the exposure the best you can because, like I said before, the movie files are very much like JPEGs. They're not like RAW. When you shoot RAW, you have this wonderful slider like in Lightroom. It's called highlight recovery, and you can recover lost highlights really well. But movies, we don't have that capability. We don't have a recovery highlight tool that we can use like when we're in our nonlinear editor. So it's really important to nail the exposure. So what I want to show you is how I set up exposure and I try to nail it the best I can. And I understand, and I definitely don't have every situation where I can set up a digital calibration target and get the exposure spot on. But if you do have the opportunity to do it, what I usually do, I will zoom in until I fill the gray. And then what I do is take the exposure until I see that the tick mark right there says we have a properly exposed image. But we can see on the histogram, if you can see it, there's two lines on either side of that white spike. Now, if I go this far, I'm too far off to the right, and you can see the meter saying you've gone too far as well. If I back it down to f8, you can see it's right in the middle, and this one's slightly to the left. And that's usually where I like to be, is slightly to the left. Sometimes it'll be right on. If I were to take that light and move it back just an inch or two, I would probably, or actually move it an inch or two forward, I could probably get it right on. And one of the things I do is on B-roll, like a lot of times I'll shoot B-roll over the years, and I'll maybe shoot it 2 or 3 different ways. And over the years, I found if I'm like a third of a stop down, I'll do a third of a stop up, and I'll do one right on, and I'll just do like 5 or 7 seconds of each. And a lot of times when I go back and the one I actually pick, because B-roll is easy, you can just shoot in a few seconds of each thing, and you're not quite sure where you should have the exposure. Shoot it a lot of different ways. I've noticed over the years that I'll usually pick the slightly darker one. For some reason, for me, it's a little bit easier to manipulate in post. So if you had the choice between this and this, I would choose f8 over the 7.1, where it's located on that particular part of the graph. But for the most part, I think we've nailed the exposure. Now, one of the things you want to keep in mind is I'm shooting with a constant aperture lens. The kit lens that comes with this is constant aperture, meaning I can zoom in and zoom out and it doesn't matter. When you get to some of the more inexpensive zooms, like the 28 to 135, if I were to do that exact same thing, I would be changing the f-stop number if I was down in the 5.6 area, like 3.5 to 5.6. You'll actually see that change. So you got to be really careful of when you're doing that. And also when you're setting up the digital calibration target, you don't want to block the light. So if you're getting in close to that digital calibrate, you don't want your head and your body to be blocking the light from behind you, because that's obviously going to change the exposure. All right, next up I want to talk about this concept of squeezing in much information in the camera and then extracting it out in post. The best way I can describe it is kind of show you, like, this picture style right here is a standard picture style, and you can see the blacks and the whites are getting kind of close to clipping. If I hit the Q button and we go to neutral, and this one has a -4. I've set it up as -4 contrast. And you can see that the histogram, the blacks and whites have come in. So I'm squeezing in as much as I can. And then later I will pull it out in post. And a lot of times if you're in a really high contrasty situation, you don't have to do anything. But I'd say maybe 90% of the time, the neutral picture style at -4 looks awesome. And you don't really have to do much tweaking to it in post. 10% of the time, then you're going to have to set the white and the black points. Basically, in really low contrast situation, we have really flat lighting where the contrast is really low. So basically, the concept I want to tell you here is it's easier to build contrast in post than it is to lower contrast in post. In fact, it's probably almost impossible. So with this in mind, because we're not shooting raw, we don't have our highlight recovery tool, and we can't expand the dynamic range like we can with a raw image. We're stuck in kind of a JPEG-ish mode with these videos. So it's best to kind of squeeze it in and then extract it out in post. A term you hear a lot, or at least I've heard in photography, is shooting to the right. And a lot of photographers, what they'll do is they'll bring the histogram kind of like right here, where it's almost clipping on the whites. We don't really want to do that on the video side. Almost the opposite. If you have your choice of either nailing the exposure or going a third of a stop lower, I'd choose, if you can nail it, great. But if you can't, a third of a stop lower would be better than going a third of a stop brighter. Because at least I found in my experience, it's a lot easier to bring up the exposure than bringing it down, because you might have lost some highlight detail, let's say in the clouds or something like that. All right, next up, we want to put it all together, the exposure triangle, and show you the mathematical relationships in one-stop increments. So here we are, we filled the frame, 18% gray, we've turned the histogram off, and we're just basically going to look at the light meter, the meter down here. So right now we're at f8, ISO 1600. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate the dial, so the jog wheel, so I'm changing the exposure, and I do 3 clicks. And 3 clicks, each is the third, so I've gone up a stop. Now if I bring 1, 2, 3, I bring it down. If I do 1, 2, 3, I bring it down another stop. Then let's say I'm shooting at f11 and for some reason you want that particular depth of field and you want to stay at f11, but you need another full stop of light. Well, what you could do is hit the ISO button and then raise 1, 2, 3, the ISO up 3 clicks. And then once the screen goes away, or if you hit the ISO button again, and then we've lost our meter, but if we hit it again, we can see we're exactly at one stop above where we were before. We added one stop of light by using the ISO. Same thing we could do here. We could, let's say, well, 3200 is way too high, or I'm going to get way too much noise. You're thinking to yourself. So you say I want to lower it down to 800. So we've gone down 2 stops. So if I hit the meter again, you can see we're down exactly 2 stops. Well, in this case, you're saying, well, I want to make it up. And one of the ways you can make it up is with 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3 with the aperture. And then boom, you can see we're exactly back up. So 1, 2, 3 or 1, 2, 3, you're going to be changing in 1 stop increments. Now on the shutter speed, if we go back to our main dial and we change the shutter speed from 50, 1, 2, 3 to 100, you can see we've gone down exactly 1 stop. 1, 2, 3. We've gone to neutral. And then if we go 1, 2, because we can't do 3 because there's no like 20th of a second or whatever that in movie mode. That's just where the shutter stops basically. So you can see we've gone up 2/3 of a stop. So basically that's how the triangle relates to each other. You can pull one up and push one down and get the right, using our meter. And again, we're using an 18% gray card. You're going to be in a lot of situations where you don't have an 18% gray card. You're doing run and gun. It's not only just those things in terms of exposure, it's the lights as well. If I were to take this light and move it twice as close, well, then it's going to change. And getting used to those relationships, the key point I want to get here is that you can move faster. So you're thinking to yourself, I need another stop of light. How do I get it? Well, I know how to move my lights closer in order to do 1 stop difference, or I know how to do it in the camera by changing the ISO or changing the aperture. It just helps you move a lot quicker to get the proper exposure. All right, we have one more tool at our disposal for adjusting exposure. Right here, we've got one of my girls' dolls. Sorry, I don't have a model with me today, or a live person. It's a situation you're going to run into a lot where maybe a lot of the frame, off to the right, you've got a window, let's say, and your meter is telling you, man, you're like way over a stop overexposed. But if you take your 18% gray card and you fill the frame, you'll see that, oh, I'm properly exposed on the meter, but when I look at it this way, I'm 1 1/3 stop too bright. Because if we were to bring the meter down, let's say all the way down to where it thinks I'm properly exposed, to me, the person is the subject, is the person, the doll in this case, and to me, the doll looks way too dark. So if I bring it back to where I had it before, right there, the other tool I'm talking about that we have at our disposal is the zoom in or the punch in tool. And so what you can do is hit the zoom button, bring it to where you think you might be blowing out or losing texture in the skin. Obviously, we've got a doll here, so it's kind of hard to see, but if you hit the zoom button again, once and then twice, you can zoom around to see if you've lost any detail. And from what I can see, maybe we've getting I can still, I don't know if you can see this, but you can still see detail around her jawline. And we're not losing any texture there, even though it's very close, but I'd say that's pretty good. So the digital calibration target, or the using just a small little gray card, and some of these are really nice because you can fold them up and you can just stick it in your pocket and it works really great. But if you're doing run and gun, you're going to have to use a tool like this to zoom in and then see if you're losing any texture, or for instance, another really problematic issue you might run into is with lights usually coming up from above. If you have somebody with really oily skin, that specular highlights are going to come off that really oily skin, and you're going to lose detail. You can either kind of wipe the guy's forehead or whatever and put some powder or makeup on there, or just try to zoom in where that is and expose it to the point where you can see some of that detail in the skin. Quick piece of advice: you want to zoom digitally, like on the person, to look around for exposure. The reason is, there's two reasons. One is if you have an inexpensive lens like a 28 to 135 where you're zooming and you're at the bottom range, or you're shooting wide open, the f-stop's actually going to change from like 3.5 to 5.6. So you're actually changing exposure while you're trying to check for exposure. So that is bad. But if you're using this lens, the 24 to 105, that's not an issue because it's a constant aperture. But one of the things that you'll run into, and especially when you're shooting wide open, is if you try to zoom optically and then zoom back out again to where you had it before, a lot of times the focus will get slightly off. Not all the time, but when you're shooting really wide open, that can definitely happen. That's pretty much it for exposure. That should give you a really good starting point to nailing the exposure, because getting the exposure is one of the most important things, if not the most important thing, that hopefully you'll learn from this course.